Welcome to the Battle of the Books. I'm Dan Glauber, local history librarian at the Scarsdale Public Library. This is one of my favorite subjects. I did an exhibit on it that's up right now in the local history room at the library. I did that a few years ago. Leslie Topping of the Scarsdale Historical Society has also written a great article about this subject that's available on the Scarsdale Historical Society's website. Hopefully I'm going to be going into a little bit more detail than either my previous exhibit or Leslie's article were able to go into. So with that said, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, is everyone seeing my presentation here?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Slideshow.
Okay.
Sorry. Okay. I just want to be able to keep an eye on the participants. More people are in the waiting room. People are still joining, so I'll get started in a minute because I don't want to keep jumping back and forth to the to let people in. Hi, Leslie Chang. Thanks for joining us. Let's see. Jordan, hello. Thanks for joining. Hi, Dara. Thanks for joining. Hi to everyone else who I haven't mentioned. All right, people have stopped jumping in, so let's go back to okay. So from 1949 to 1954, a group of citizens calling themselves the Committee of 10 and later the Citizens Committee waged a campaign against what they saw as communist infiltration into the Scarsdale schools. The controversy, which became known as the Battle of the Books, was covered nationally. It was one of a number of similar situations as people were inflamed by McCarthyism around the country. The schools, as always, played an important role in this national discussion over what should be taught to our children and by whom. Sorry, I'm just checking the chat. Okay. We can see the same thing playing out over the last 80 years in many different forms. Tonight we're going to go through the details of the Battle of the Books. I hope doing so will not only illuminate the nature of the controversy at the time, but also have applications to current issues. So please feel free to ask questions as I go along, and I plan to leave time for discussion at the end. So here's just a brief outline of my presentation tonight. I'm going to start by talking about the origins of the Committee of 10. Then I'm going to go into the first phase of the issue, which revolved mainly around books in the high school library and textbooks used by the high school. Then the second phase about speakers who were brought in to speak to the PTA for professional development for teachers, but these were outside speakers who the Committee of 10 objected to. And then in the third section, or my fourth section, but the third sort of phase of the Battle of the Books, the Citizens Committee began to attack local residents and search for those who were behind the infiltration that they saw in the Scarsdale schools. So the origins of the Committee of 10. It all starts with Otto Dodenrand. He was a Wall Street banker and the driving force behind the anti-communist movement in Scarsdale. He was born in 1899 and graduated from Columbia University in 1917 at the age of 18. Very young to graduate from college. During World War II, he enlisted and was assigned to officers training school, receiving his commission after the war ended. After 11 years as a banker, he became a general partner of Baker, Weeks and Company, a Wall Street investment firm. He moved to Scarsdale around 1935, where he joined the local chapter of the American Legion and attended the Immaculate Heart of Mary Catholic Church. He became concerned about communist infiltration in 1947 while serving on a US federal grand jury investigating a communist in the State Department. In the late 1950s, after his group was defeated in Scarsdale and the American Legion post-52 rejected McCarthyism, he moved his efforts to the county level, where he was co-founder of the Westchester Spotlight, the counter-subversive publication of the American Legion Westchester County Committee on Un-American Activities. He never gave up his fight against communism, passing away in 1989, missing the fall of the Soviet Union by only 2 years. So as I just outlined, Otto's awakening came when he served on a federal grand jury. He said of that time serving on the jury, "I was naive about communism until early in 1947 when I served on a federal grand jury investigating a communist in the State Department. I was so shocked by what I learned about the treasonable character of communism that I studied its strategy and techniques. I became convinced that communism was most dangerous in the field of education." And this is from a talk he gave to the Knights of Columbus in Larchmont in 1950. Later that year, Dodenrand learned that Paul Draper had spoken at the house of Mrs. Leon Pines at 16 Highland Way on October 24th for a meeting of the Progressive Citizens of America. The PCA was a social democratic political organization formed in December 1946 that advocated progressive policies. It worked with the labor organization, CIO, and allegedly the Communist Party USA. It was a precursor for the Progressive Party, which formed in 1948. Draper himself was a tap dancer who was an international star in the 1930s and 40s. His affiliation with progressive organizations led to his blacklisting in 1949. He left the US in 1951 and lived in Switzerland for 3 years until McCarthyism ebbed. The Pines, who hosted the meeting at which Paul Draper spoke, were a Jewish family involved in various Jewish organizations such as the Zionist Organization of America, Hadassah, and Children to Palestine, and they were members of Temporal Israel. They appear to have left the community by the 1960s. In 1948, Otto Dodenrand continued to note speakers with supposed communist connections, including local resident Ernest O. Melby, as well as Lisa Sergio and Vera McKellis Dean. He also fixated on the inclusion of 11 books by Howard Fast in the Scarsdale High School library, as well as a book by Anna Louise Strong. Let's see. So these are the 3 people that I just mentioned that concerned Otto in 1948. Lisa Sergio was an Italian-American who lived from 1905 to 1989. She was a radio broadcaster under Mussolini in Italy and became a leading anti-fascist broadcaster and one of the first women to have her own radio news commentary program. Sergio began to work for local New York City station WQXR in 1939 and became one of the first female commentators on WQXR, developing her program, A Column of the Air. She had been the subject of extensive FBI surveillance since she immigrated to the United States and was blacklisted by the American Legion in 1949 and listed in the anti-communist publication Red Channels in 1950. She identified as a feminist, writing and delivering many lectures and articles on feminism and women in the years after World War II. Sergio is one of a tightly knit group of women who would today be described as queer in government, publishing, and broadcasting, and her programs often featured other queer women on her shows. Vera Dean was a scholar of international relations and helped to shape American foreign policy through her writing. She fled the Russian Revolution with her family, settling in America. After schooling, she began working with the Foreign Policy Association, pioneering popular education in international relations. She directed research on foreign policy and edited the Foreign Policy Bulletin, among others. She was invited by the State Department to advise the American delegation at the founding of the United Nations. She focused particularly on United States-Soviet Union relations, writing an influential book, The United States and Russia, in 1946, becoming one of the first experts to decry the Cold War. She was accused of pro-Soviet views in the late 1940s and 50s. McCarthyists targeted works published by Dean, seeking to remove them from libraries. Finally, Ernest O. Melby, who was a Scarsdale resident and would be involved in the Battle of the Books for the coming years, was the dean of the NYU School of Education from 1945 to 56. During that time, he lived in Scarsdale on Stoneleigh Avenue. He was born in Minnesota and began his career as a physics teacher. He then served as professor of education and dean of the School of Education at Northwestern from 1928 to 1941. After a few years as president of the University of Montana, he took the position at NYU. Doenrend contended that Melby had been a vice chairman of the Education Committee of the National Council of American Soviet Friendship. This group, which succeeded the National Council on Soviet Relations in 1941, grew out of the more overtly radical American-Soviet friendship movement of the 1930s, whose organizational center was the Friends of the Soviet Union, founded in 1929. The council, composed largely of professionals sympathetic to socialism, believed that the USSR and the United States should join together in their common fight against fascism. However, in 1946, the House Un-American Activities Committee began a formal investigation of the group, and in 1947, it was indicted for failure to register with the Subversive Activities Control Board. Throughout its operation, the group issued numerous pamphlets and bibliographies about life in the Soviet Union, as well as information on American-Soviet relations. Doenrend also mentioned Melby's connection to the American Education Fellowship, the Social Frontier Group, and the American Committee to Save Refugees. The first was a progressive education group which emerged out of the Progressive Education Association. The second was a group that desired to merge progressive education with progressive politics. The latter was an organization established to support refugees from the Spanish Civil War, particularly those opposing Franco's nationalists. Doenrend also criticized Melby's decision to allow Howard Fast and Edward K. Barsky to speak at NYU under his administration. Not surprisingly, given Melby's career and position, he had significant influence on the educational philosophy of the Scarsdale schools during his time in Scarsdale. Early in 1949, Otto Doenrend met Reverend William C. Kernan, Assistant Minister of the Episcopal Church of St. James the Less here in Scarsdale. Kernan sought out Otto after being approached by a parishioner who was concerned about a prominent educator who had been chosen to speak before her chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution, whom she had heard was a communist. That spring and summer, Doenrend and Kernan expressed their concerns about communist infiltration in the school system privately with the superintendent, the high school principal, and the PTA. Over the summer, they searched for others to join their crusade, forming the Committee of 10. I want to stop here and talk about a little bit about William C. Kernan, because he was one of the other extremely important members of the Committee of 10. His story is also fascinating. He was born in 1899 in Chicago and grew up poor. He served in World War I and went on to graduate from Yale and then from the Greater Theological Seminary in New York City. During the 1930s, he became involved in progressive causes, supporting labor unions and opposing fascism. By 1938, he was serving as rector of the Trinity Episcopal Church in Bayonne, New Jersey. At the same time, he continued his activism. He was a regular on local radio station WEVD, speaking out against dictatorial Jersey City Mayor Frank Hague, as well as groups like the Christian Front and the German-American Bund, the German-American Nazi organization, which was established in 1936. He supported the US entry into World War II in order to oppose fascist Germany. He became disillusioned with communism when Russia and Germany signed the Non-Aggression Pact and began to associate communism with fascism. While he had been happy to support labor and socialist organizations, he began to see communism as part of a fifth column of fascists attempting to bring about totalitarian rule in America. He no longer supported freedom of speech in all cases, believing that these fifth column elements were misusing the Bill of Rights in an effort to take over the nation from within. Meanwhile, he'd been forced to resign his position at Trinity Episcopal Church in 1939 because of his activism. He moved his family to Scarsdale in 1940, settling on Ferncliff Road, and soon joined St. James Episcopal Church, becoming friendly with Rector James Price, who took him on as assistant minister. Price had a profound influence on Kernan. Price was troubled by the lack of truth in modern secularism. He believed that truth flowed from God and that without that anchor, man was set adrift in a sea of relativism. Kernan adopted this belief, which led him to oppose secularism, especially in the schools. During the 1940s, Kernan worked 3 days a week at St. James the Less. The rest of the time he spent in New York City, supporting Roosevelt and arguing for the United States to aid the Allies against Germany, opposing attacks by commun-Nazi groups on the home front, and pursuing social justice for all Americans, regardless of race, creed, or color. He joined the Committee to Defend America by aiding the Allies, which directly opposed Lindbergh's America First movement. He spent time at Freedom House, an organization dedicated to promoting American democracy at home and abroad. He became a founding member of the Liberal Party, an organization created by the right wing of the New York State American Labor Party. After the Allies won World War II, Kernan became repulsed by his liberal friends who did not see the danger that communism posed. He no longer considered himself a liberal because the liberal movement had become godless. In 1949, a female parishioner of St. James the Less took him aside, and I talked about this a little bit earlier, asking about the prominent educator. At that time, he was directed to Otto Doenrend, and who provided Kernan with the names and backgrounds of several people who were associated with communist fronts who had been allowed to address the Scarsdale PTA and Scarsdale Teachers Association. Thus, Kernan and Doenrend were united, and together they became the driving force behind the Committee of 10 and their crusade against communist infiltration in the Scarsdale schools. Let me pause here to take a drink of water. Does anyone have any questions or comments at this time? Oh, there's people waiting to be admitted. Okay. I apologize if you were in the waiting room. Someone says, can't hear you very well. Can other people hear me? Are people having
Yes.
trouble hearing me?
Yeah.
Yes,
I have a question.
Yes.
What's soft? Yeah.
So you referred to a trial earlier, where one of the men you were describing went to a trial of someone who was in the State Department. Was that Hess?
No.
You know, I'm not sure about that. That was Otto Doenrend, who, that's how he became aware of communism and really got turned on to the issue. But, you know, I'm not sure about that. That's an interesting question. Does anyone have any insight on that? I'll have to look at that later. I apologize to people who may have been waiting in the waiting room. I was in the middle of part of the lecture and I did not see you. So I hope you'll enjoy the rest of it. We just finished talking about the formation of the, I'll try to speak louder, about the formation of the Committee of 10, which revolved around two people, Otto Doenrend, a Scarsdale resident and a Wall Street banker, and the Reverend William C. Kiernan of the St. James Episcopal Church. Okay, going to go back to this. Oops. Part 1. First, they came for the books. The school board was aware of Dawnrend M. Kiernan, who'd already been lobbying behind closed doors to have certain books removed from the high school library. At the first meeting of the new school year on September 16, 1949, the board was preoccupied with addressing the new Feinberg Act, New York state law which banned from the teaching profession anyone who called for the overthrow of the government and was specifically aimed at communists. The law required boards of education to take oaths of loyalty from teachers and administrators and to ensure that none were members of the Communist Party USA or any affiliated groups. So perhaps the board was somewhat blindsided when Otto Dawnrend, along with his counsel John G. Kelly of Scarsdale Manor, raised questions about the method of selecting books and school library books, selecting textbooks and school library books. In particular, Dawnrend mentioned novels by Howard Fast and an anthology of poetry edited by Louis Untermeyer. Acting Superintendent Archibald B. Shaw was prepared with answers regarding the methods of book selection, spelling out the procedure for Mr. Dawnrend. At the following board meeting, held October 3rd, approximately 60 people turned out, making the meeting's attendance the largest recorded in board history. Both sides had marshaled their forces. Kiernan took the lead this time, protesting against the inclusion of books by communist and fascist apologists, such as Howard Fast, Anna Louise Strong, Louis Untermeyer, and Shirley Graham. At one point, Dawnrend remarked that, quote, the whole textbook industry has been infiltrated by communists, for which he received a cold stare from S. Spencer Scott, president of the publisher Harcourt Brace & Co., which had published the Untermeyer poetry collection. Chauncey Newlin, the board president, was quoted as saying, I don't care a hoot what a man's politics or religion are if he writes a good book. The board referred the issue of book selection to its Educational Policies Committee and the meeting was adjourned. Just check and make sure no one's waiting to come in. I've got one more person, okay. The composition of the Board of Education shifted over the 4 years of the controversy, but its initial members were A. Chauncey Newlin, Lillian C. Brown, Robert G. Fuller, G. Stanley McAllister, Malcolm C. Spence, and Emily Rothschild. Newlin was board president in 1949 and served through the 1951-52 school year. He was a partner in the Wall Street firm of White and Chase and was involved as a director of the Met and as a trustee of the Guggenheim Museum. As you'll see, these were not leftist intellectuals, but mostly conservative businessmen who would end up opposing McCarthyism in Scarsdale. An interesting note about Newlin is that he was married to Janet Bethel, daughter of Florence Bethel, leader of the Scarsdale suffrage movement in the 1910s. And we recently had an exhibit about that, which was done by myself as well as the Scarsdale Historical Society. Lillian C. Brown was an elder and deacon at the Hitchcock Presbyterian Church, president of the Scarsdale Women's Interchurch Council, was involved with the local Girl Scouts, and would later be appointed to the Advisory Committee on Human Relations created during the creche controversy of the early 1980s. She served on the board for 7 years and for the entirety of the book controversy. Robert G. Fuller was a graduate of Harvard Business School and an executive at First National Bank. He was also a member of the Library Board of Trustees during his time in Scarsdale. G. Stanley McAllister was an executive of the Associated Dry Goods Corporation, which owned Lord & Taylor, and was active in the Mormon Church. Malcolm C. Spence had a master's from Columbia Teachers College, though he went into banking, working for the Bank of New York from 1929 to 1966. He was a graduate of the Horace Mann School and remained involved in supporting the school throughout his life. He was a deacon at the Scarsdale Congregational Church and served as school board president from 1953 to 55. Amelie Rothschild was the first Jewish member of the Board of Trustees. Her son, Eric Rothschild, became a beloved teacher at the high school and served as village historian. She was an educator prior to moving to Scarsdale and later was one of 2 New York State representatives at President Eisenhower's White House Conference on Education. She was president of the League of Women Voters of Scarsdale, associate director of the New York Civil Liberties Union, and in 1958 was honored by inclusion in the first Who's Who of American Women. In the 1970s, she wrote a book on the history of the Scarsdale school system titled "It Didn't Just Happen," which was a significant source of information for this presentation. Understanding the composition of the board is important to fully understanding the dynamics of the conflict. At least I hope it is. Otherwise, I just wasted a few minutes. Just check really quickly that no one's waiting to get in. Okay. Did I say the first, she was the first Jewish woman, Amelie Rothschild. Did I say just the first Jewish person? Was there a Jew, who was on the board prior to that who was Jewish? There was one prior Jewish member, according to Jordan Copeland.
Louis Untermeyer.
Ah, okay. Louis Untermeyer?
Yes.
I have a question. It says, Jordan says Amelie was the first Jewish woman on the Board of Education. You said, I believe that she was the first woman trustee. So you could do.
Well, I meant trustee of the Board of Education.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. Louis Untermeyer was the author, a poet, and one of the people that that the Committee of 10 was objecting to. Jordan says that it was Ernest someone who was the first Jewish person on the Board of Education. Let's see. So taking a look at the authors accused here. All of the authors singled out by the Committee of 10 were either members of the Communist Party or involved in associated organizations. The primary target of the Committee of 10 was the author Howard Fast. Born in 1914, the child of Jewish immigrants, Fast grew up in poverty when his mother passed away in 1923 and his father struggled to support the family on his own. His first novel, Two Valleys, was published in 1933, but his breakout came in 1943 with the publication of Citizen Tom Paine, which received a highly favorable review in the New York Times. The novel was credited with restoring the reputation of Paine, who had been maligned for some of his more controversial views, despite his importance in the American Revolution. This was the book that became the primary focus of the Committee of 10 during the following months, though his most famous novel was Spartacus, which was adapted into a movie by Stanley Kubrick starring Kirk Douglas in 1960. During World War II, Fast worked for the United States Office of War Information, writing for The Voice of America. In 1943, he joined the Communist Party USA. Later in life, he would attribute his decision to join the Communist Party at least partially to his experience growing up poor, the child of immigrants. In 1950, he was called before the House Committee on Un-American Activities, where he refused to disclose the names of contributors to a fund for a home for orphans of American veterans of the Spanish Civil War, of which Eleanor Roosevelt was one of the contributors, and was given a 3-month prison sentence for contempt of Congress. In 1952, he ran for Congress on the American Labor Party ticket. He worked for the communist newspaper, The Daily Worker. In 1953, he was awarded the Stalin Peace Prize, but by 1956, he'd become disillusioned with the Soviet Union, with revelations of Stalin's terror and the spread of anti-Semitism in the USSR. He left the party, and in 1957, he published The Naked God, the writer and the Communist Party, describing his journey in the party and subsequent disillusionment. He wrote, "There was the evil in what we dreamed of as communists. We took the noblest dreams and hopes of mankind as our credo. The evil we did was to accept the degradation of our own souls. and because we surrendered in ourselves, in our own party existence, all the best and most precious gains and liberties of mankind. Because we did this, we betrayed mankind, and the Communist Party became a thing of destruction. Anna Louise Strong was born in Nebraska to middle-class liberals involved in missionary work and the Congregational Church. She was an advocate for child welfare and joined the National Child Labor Committee around the same time. In 1910, she was elected to the Seattle School Board, and at the same time, she started moving into journalism. She held radical pro-labor positions, including opposing US entry into World War I and support for the Russian Revolution. Kicked off the school board in 1918, she joined the staff of the Seattle Union Record, and in 1919 covered the Seattle General Strike. In 1921, she traveled to Poland and Russia as a correspondent for the American Friends Service Committee, a Quaker organization. Over the next decade, she became one of the country's most influential left-wing journalists and authorities on the Soviet Union. In the late 1920s, she traveled to China and other parts of Asia to report on the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese Civil War. In 1930, she returned to Moscow and established Moscow News, the first English-language newspaper in the city. During World War II, she followed the Red Army as it advanced on Berlin. She returned to China in 1947 and interviewed Mao. She was expelled from the USSR in 1949 after being accused of being an American spy, ironically. She returned to the US and was denied a passport, meaning she couldn't travel to China until 1958, when she won her case before the Supreme Court. She then returned to China, where she settled permanently until her death. She remained a vocal supporter of Chinese communism, criticizing the US invasions of Korea and Vietnam as imperialist. And then Louis Untermeyer, who was born in New York City, the son of a German Jewish jewelry manufacturer. He opposed US entry into World War I in the leftist periodical, The Masses. In 1918, he began writing for The Liberator, published by the Workers' Party of America. Later, he wrote for the independent socialist magazine, The New Masses. In 1935, he joined the League of American Writers, whose members were mostly communists or fellow travelers. His views were centered around a core belief in pacifism. In 1950, he was a panelist on the first season of the famous panel game show, What's My Line?, but was forced to resign after being blacklisted based on his former associations with communist and progressive organizations. And finally, Shirley Graham Du Bois was born in Indianapolis to an African Methodist Episcopal minister. In 1936, she was appointed director of the Chicago Negro Unit of the Federal Theater Project, which was part of the WPA. This project was shut down in 1939 by anti-communists. She then worked for the YWCA from 40 to 42. The YWCA supported the federal anti-lynching law, but anti-communist and white supremacist groups accused it of being a communist front organization controlled by Jews. In the late 1940s, Graham Du Bois joined the Sojourners for Truth and Justice, an African-American organization working for global women's liberation. Around the same time, she also joined the Communist Party of America. In 1951, she married W.E.B. Du Bois. She was 54 and he was 83. Mr. Du Bois had by this time also become a believer in communism. Together, they endured a number of legal battles during the McCarthy era. In 1961, they moved to Ghana. W.E.B. Du Bois died in 1963, and in 1966, she moved to Cairo. She spent the rest of her time traveling to promote anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism. She passed away in China in 1977, where she'd gone to seek treatment for breast cancer. Any questions or comments? Okay. So the Scarsdale Battle of the Books gained national attention when it was covered in the Herald Tribune in October 1949. After the story broke, Robert Gordon, president of the town club, invited a dozen key people over to his house, among whom were the presidents of the Women's Club, the PTA, and the League of Women Voters. A statement was drawn up and a list of 100 names to approach for signatures was created. By Friday, they had 81 signatures, including every living former mayor and school board president. Other signers included Charles E. Wilson, president of GE, Harry Humphreys Jr., president of the US Rubber Co., Sigurd S. Larman, president of the advertising agency of Young and Rubicam, John M. Hancock, investment banker, Alan Sproul, president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Alexander C. Nagel, president of the First National Bank of New York, and Sidney J. Weinberg, president of Goldman Sachs. In their statement that was signed by these very prominent people, they wrote, "We do not minimize the dangers of communist and fascist indoctrination, but we want to meet these dangers in the American way. We live in a democratic state. We are the inheritors of a tradition that has encouraged a dynamic development in our intellectual as well as our material life. That tradition has been based on a tolerance that has not feared to permit the expression of views alternative to those held by the majority." At the school board meeting on November 3rd, the Educational Policies Committee made its report on the method of book selection. The report was adopted by the board in executive session. In addition to the committee's report, Superintendent Shaw prepared a report on the manner of selection of books. The meeting was attended by over 175 people and had to be moved to the high school gym to accommodate everyone. In response to the reports, Kiernan quoted paragraphs from Fast's books as proof of what he called distortion of American history by showing the American Revolution as a class struggle instead of a war against Great Britain. This quote from the Educational Policies Committee report is, I took some excerpts from it, so it'll just give you an idea of what the report was arguing. The Board of Education has received a request that books written by Howard Fast, Shirley Graham, and Anna Louise Strong be excluded from the school libraries, and an anthology by Louis Untermeyer be withdrawn from use as a textbook. The committee recognizes that determined and sometimes insidious efforts are being made to promote communist doctrine in our country. The committee is concerned, however, lest sincere efforts to eliminate the threat of subversive influences in our American system of education may initiate censorship that will be completely un-American in itself. Our young people shall be permitted and encouraged to decide what they will believe through sound intellectual, moral, and spiritual conviction, rather than through authoritarian indoctrination. Such exclusion would say to our young people that we fear the competition of ideas. It would say that freedom is really only freedom for conformists. We cannot have it both ways. We cannot have the freedom that we prize above all if at the same time we limit that freedom to those who already agree with us. So here's some quotes from Citizen Tom Paine, which I read. The first quote clearly establishes the conflict between us, the slaves, and them, the aristocracy. They drove us like slaves for 5,000 years, but now we are taking the world for ourselves. And when our marching feet sound, my God, friends, who will be able to stop their ears? The second quote refers to what was seen as war profiteering in Philadelphia. In 1779, price controls were implemented in the city and several merchants were arrested for profiteering. He had seen the army split up into opposing groups, and he had seen staunch patriots eager to sell out to the highest bidder. And now he was watching one of the final phases, a cleavage between the People's Party and the party of finance, of trade and power and aristocracy. The third quote refers to Paine's later work attempting to foment the revolution in England and then joining the French Revolution. The idea of a brotherhood of man spread over the entire world might have seemed alarming to anti-communists who saw that as communism's goal. The quote here, then the idea, the vague shape, the conception so huge that he had hardly dared to think of it until now, fixed itself in his mind as a reality. The United States of Europe allied with the United States of America, a brotherhood of man that at the most would take 7 years to accomplish, and eventually, possibly before the end of the 18th century, would spread over the entire world. In the fourth quote here, Paine expresses the feeling that along with the peasants he represented, they were just tools in the machinations of wealthy men. Slowly, he was becoming aware that these great and important men of the colonies, even Jefferson, whose reason was creed and a religion, looked upon him as a sort of performing animal, a peasant to represent the numberless peasants who would make up the army of rebellion, a clever rabble-rouser to be used for their purposes. Finally, in the last quote here, Paine talks about his beliefs about, it does reflect Paine's beliefs about religion. He was a deist, seeing God in nature and the beauty of the world around us, though he was not a fan of organized religion and was a vocal critic of Christianity. He expressed these views in his final collection of writings known as the Age of Reason. This collection in particular led to his loss of popularity. In the end, he died poor and mostly alone, rejected because of his radical deism. And in Fast's book, he has Paine say, "The New World had renounced God, and thereby, to Paine's way of thinking, they had renounced the reason for man to exist. Man is part of God, or else he is a beast, and beasts know love and fear and hate and hunger, but no exultation. As Paine saw it now, man's history was a vision of godliness. He had proclaimed God in all that man saw, in the perfect symmetry of a leaf, in a rosy sunset, in a million stars cast like a hood in the night, in the earth, in the sea, in all creation. He had told them to believe in God because they and the world they inhabited were the strongest proof of God. It was a blazing, living sign document, and it required neither superstitions nor horror tales to support it." So while relative quiet reigned during the holiday season at the end of 1949, J. Anthony Marcus's letter to the editor of the Scarsdale Inquirer kept the controversy in the news. Marcus, born in Russia in 1896, came to the United States in 1910. During the 1910s, he served as an interpreter, investigator, and special agent with the Immigration, Foreign Trade, and Employment Services of the US government. In the 1920s, he was the Reconstruction Director in the Baltic countries for the Joint Distribution Committee doing relief work in Jewish communities. He also became involved in foreign trade during this time. After World War II, he became concerned with the spread of communism and appeared before several congressional committees to testify on the menace of communism. His letter called attention to a statement Fast made in the Daily Worker on November 10th, 1949, regarding the Communist Party. And here's an excerpt from the letter. "I have been a silent spectator to the book controversy in our community. The following statement in the communist mouthpiece, The Daily Worker, of November 10th, 1949, however, impels me to break my self-imposed silence. Quote, 'There is no nobler, no finer product of man's existence on this earth,' writes Mr. Howard Fast, 'than the Communist Party. Lenin has taught, and his disciples all over the world are following faithfully, that in order to bring about his slave state, nothing is immoral, that one may lie, cheat, deceive, falsify facts in history, murder, do anything for the sake of carrying out the party line. The American communists carry this out with a zeal even unknown to the Russian breed.'" In January 1950, Howard Fast responded to Marcus's letter in an attempt to defend his honor and his right to express his political opinions. In part, he wrote, "Via the clipping service, I've been following the long drawn-out controversy over my novels, which has appeared in the correspondence columns of your newspaper. But I find that Mr. Marcus, in his letter, has by implication accused me of being a red fascist."
You're frozen.
Can't hear you.
You went silent, sir.
Frozen.
Okay, I see it saying my internet connection is unstable. Is it still frozen?
No, you're okay.
Okay. I was just in the process of reading part of Howard Fast's response to the Marcus letter. He writes, "Our country was founded, Mr. Marcus should know, on the right of individuals and of minorities to disagree. Finally, I find it more than passing strange that those like Mr. Marcus, who constantly rant about the immorality of communists, and who think that anyone who disagrees with their self-anointed position may well be a communist, are themselves a little less than moral, both in their practice of unfounded accusations and in their somewhat unholy lust for a monolithic state as they themselves see it.
Hope you weren't drinking in there.
The Inquirer also sent a reply to Fast and published it at the end of his letter. They wrote,
If you're walking.
Please be quiet in the
People-
background. Please,
you could
everybody.
just mute yourself, or I'll, let me see who's not muted. Okay. The Inquirer will take great pleasure, as would any newspaper worth the name in a still free country, in printing your letter in this week's issue. However, not having denied the correctness of the quotation attributed to you in the Daily Worker November 10th, your letter might in legal terms be called a plea and confession and avoidance. Whether or not Mr. Marcus overstated the practices of communism, the average American surveying the present condition of Eastern Europe, not to mention Asia, finds no reason to admire communism as practiced, or to desire the further extension of its influence in this country. The Inquirer upheld the position of the Board of Education that books should be judged by content, not by authorship, and still finds in those books no argument for communism as now politically practiced. Things picked up again at the February 6th board meeting in 1950, at which Scarsdale resident Cyril Tracy gave page references for Citizen Tom Paine, which he argued were blasphemous and immoral, including a scene depicting a slave auction in Philadelphia. Superintendent Shaw responded to Tracy by saying that he had just reread the book and would be glad to talk to Mr. Tracy about his concerns. Tracy responded that, quote, in the matter of a book opposed to the Ten Commandments, to the Bible, to almost everything, it didn't seem necessary to go to the professional staff. Mrs. Eldred Reynolds agreed with Tracy, calling the book a, quote, dirty, vile volume. Meanwhile, Doe and Wren brought up the textbook American Democracy Today and Tomorrow, calling it communistic. At the end of the meeting, Kiernan put the board on notice, declaring, do not deceive yourselves, ladies and gentlemen, this matter is not closed. And Mrs. Rothschild also said, each of us is sincere in our beliefs. Because we disagree on a vital issue, no one has a right to say we don't care. Here's a little bit on the textbook, American Democracy Today and Tomorrow, but I sort of cover this later. So basically, I'll just summarize really quickly here that the authors were members of a group called the People's League for Economic Security. They published a book called Rich Man, Poor Man, Pictures of a Paradox. The group was founded by Henry Pratt Fairchild and Professor John Dewey of Columbia. And there are instances in the book where some new standards of value are necessary in the modern world. Actually, I do want to read a quote from it. American values developed out of the struggle for a new continent and out of the lives of free pioneers. We still cling to these old values, but times have changed. Many Americans found security in the ownership of land or the possession of wealth. Through many years of our history, this path to security was open to all. Today, the man with no possessions and little chance of securing either land or wealth, what opportunity remains of enjoying security as one of his values? With the growth of modern industry, insecurity of employment has increased for the individual. The worker was first separated from his own particular craft, then from the tools which he owned, then from any personal relationship with the owner who hired or fired him. Finally, he became merely a tiny part of a great industrial process, likely to be thrown out of work as easily as a machine could be stopped by the press of a button. For the worker, the union becomes the only possible method of developing sufficient power to be able to bargain successfully with employers for a fair share of the income from production. Thus, a union is not a political organization for class war. It is not an instrument of revolution. It is not a lawless combination to redistribute wealth. Rather, the organization of a union is an honest attempt on the part of workers to build for themselves a bargaining power to improve working conditions and to raise wages, so that the price they receive for their productive efforts will cover the cost of an adequate standard of living for themselves and their families. And that's from page 309. And I actually have a copy of this textbook, which is on display in the local history room if you want to look at it. Okay. At the next Board of Education meeting, in response to a request by Cyril Tracy made after the previous meeting, the board asked for a full report on citizen Tom Paine. Tracy, who moved to Scarsdale, had moved to Scarsdale in 1928. His work was as a chemical engineer and business executive. He was a member of the Scarsdale American Legion Post 52 and attended the Immaculate Heart of Mary Catholic Church. Here we see another connection between the Committee of 10 and the American Legion, as well as the Catholic Church. The report was prepared by the head of the English department, Coburn H. Iyer, the head of the Social Studies Department, Miss Cleora Such, and the head librarian, Miss Helen C. Still. They reported spending a combined 33 hours working on the project. The book was restudied based on the criteria for book selection laid out by Archibald Shaw late last year, the previous year. According to the report, they found that far from following the communist line, in 3 specific instances where that line could have been followed, it was actually opposed. The board subsequently met on April 2nd and reported that the Educational Policies Committee recommended accepting the report given on citizen Tom Paine in the previous meeting. Outraged, Kiernan declared, "The board has gone on record in direct contradiction to the teachings of the church. I will see that word of this is spread outside of Scarsdale." Dr. Morris Krantz responded that Kiernan had already spread word at a meeting in White Plains, at which Kiernan had spent the entire time, quote, roasting the board, citizens, and school system. Kiernan replied that he'd do it again. Tracy read more excerpts from citizen Tom Paine and said that the book in question is a course in advanced blasphemy. Dr. Alan Gregg, a former president of the board, expressed himself as troubled at the tendency to use authoritarian methods to attain what some individuals consider good ends. Quote, "I would rather let children arrive at their own decisions than to keep evidence from them and give them the suspicion that things were being kept from them. We can't settle the question of forms of government by oppression and prescription of books." Mrs. Martin J. Brennan said that, quote, "There is more to this than just books. Secularism in the school is the fundamental issue." Dr. Charles A. Pereira noted that all of us here despise communism, but all know of the class struggle in this country, slavery, sweatshops. I am not afraid to tell my children what has been wrong in the past. Chauncey Newland, still board president at the time, noted the negative effects of the controversy on the school district itself. Quote, "The considerations here transcend those of the content of a book. We must consider the effect on the morale of the school staff, the effect on mature students, on the standing of the Scarsdale schools in the educational world. Acceding to this pressure would be felt in our ability to get good teachers, and the ability of our graduates to get into better colleges. Here we catch a glimpse of another motivation for the board's stance against the Committee of 10. Scarsdale's schools were its prized possession, serving to move the children of the privileged onto the Ivy League schools, giving them access to the halls of power. Anything that threatened the reputation of the Scarsdale schools struck at this essential connection." Did anyone have any comments? I thought I heard something. Okay, I got to move it along here because I'm not nearly done. So we'll probably have to just, we probably won't have much time for discussion. So please feel free to raise issues as I go along, and whatever I don't go through will, I'll probably schedule a second talk to continue because I'm definitely not going to get through the entire thing tonight. So meanwhile, Otto Doenrend continued to indoctrinate the rest of Post 52 with his extreme form of anti-communism. He arranged for Theodore C. Kirkpatrick, editor of the weekly anti-communist newsletter Counterattack, to speak to the Legion on April 5th. Kirkpatrick had been an FBI agent from 1941 to 45. It was rumored that Ed Sullivan consulted him on guests to avoid as quote unquote pinkos. Speaking at the meeting to over 180 members and guests, Mr. Counterattack, as he was sometimes called, made clear the dire nature of the communist invasion of the United States. Quote, "We cannot control thoughts, nor can we be good sports in dealing with communists. The communist plan is to take over this country in any way they can, as soon as they can. Their methods do not include fair play and good sportsmanship. They will do anything to accomplish their purpose. We must get communists out of all key positions in this country, all communists and their sympathizers, whether it be in the field of government, amusements, or a writer with books in our schools." On May 2nd, the first school board election since the eruption of the Battle of Books allowed members of the community to express their opinion on the issue through their vote. 1,400 residents turned up to vote or voice opinions. Previous year, there had been only 58 votes. Robert Gordon, town club president, who had previously organized the statement signed by prominent residents, had organized a telephone campaign out of fear that the Committee of 10 might try to challenge the nonpartisan method. Scarsdale still uses the nonpartisan system today. Under this system, a large group of elected nominators is tasked with picking candidates for the school board. Once these candidates are vetted and accept the nomination, they usually run unopposed for their positions. Occasionally, an alternative slate has run against the nonpartisan candidates. Strangely, at no time during the Battle of the Books did the Committee of 10 put forth a set of alternative candidates. While write-ins are allowed, the nonpartisan candidates were elected easily. Chauncey Newland received 1,081 votes, George Rutherford 1,085, and Stanley McAllister 1,084. There were 16 blanks and one write-in apiece for Kernan, Doenrand, Tracy, and E.W. Berlin. So we made it through part one. It's already 8:28. So we've got about another 15 minutes before we have to wrap it up. Does anyone have anything they want to talk about?
You've indicated that we're not going to finish tonight. May I suggest that you take our email addresses and contact us directly when the next meeting is going to be virtual?
Yes, I will do that. I have all of your email addresses. Otherwise, you wouldn't have gotten the Zoom invitation. So when I set up the next session, I will let you all know. Does anyone else have anything, or should I continue for now?
I would suggest that your next session start at part 2. And if we have, any opportunity to discuss your part 1, that would be a good that we use the remainder amount of time to do that. My name is BK Mungia.
Thank you.
That's
I was
a good
thinking the
idea.
same thing since we had just reached part 2. So
This was I thought it was very interesting that because I've been very much involved over the course of the time I've lived in Scarsdale on the nonpartisan system. And your ability to be able to, show that at the end of what seemed to be a pretty controversial time for Scarsdale, especially with respect to the schools that everyone cares about, is that there was no effort to run against the slate at that time, and that you had a sizable number of people come out to vote in support of that. Were these from articles in the Scarsdale Inquirer essentially that you were able to find?
yes, fantastically, we have the Scarsdale Inquirer digitized through 1977 right now. And so this period is really easy to access, and it was covered very well in the Inquirer, thank goodness.
So could you tell us a little bit about where else this was publicized? I mean, you mentioned the fact that there was a discussion in White Plains, but did this actually make the New York City newspapers, this controversy?
Yes. So late in 1949, there was an article, I believe it was the New York Herald Tribune that I had mentioned, but it was picked up in the New York paper there. And then later on, as I get into part 2 and part 3, you'll see that there were numerous numerous magazine articles covering the entire situation. Most of them sympathetic to the board, but even a few of them sympathetic to the Committee of 10. So Commentary magazine had an article. It was covered in the Christian Science Monitor. I can't remember the others at this time, but it was covered nationally, and there were other places throughout the country that were going through similar issues where there wasn't such a robust opposition to the, the equivalent committees of 10, whatever they called themselves. There was sort of a national movement through the National American Legion and other organizations, other right-wing organizations, to combat what they saw as not just McCarthyism in the school, not just communism in the schools, but also secularism, the removal of religion, progressive education. Leslie notes it was also covered in the New York Times in 1952. Thank you, Leslie Topping.
Yeah, one observation, this is John Mark. In those days, I believe there were 2 school districts in Scarsdale, Union Free School District number 1 and Union Free School District number 2, which was essentially Quaker Ridge, where I went to school. Is there anything that you've found in the record that indicates similar sorts of debate in Union Free School District number 2 at this time? I'm sure there was.
Not really. So at that time, was the high school for District 2 still separate, or was it just the lower schools?
It was kindergarten through 8th grade was separate, and then everyone from Quaker Ridge went to the one high school.
So I think most of the controversy centered around the high school, though there were some other, things that came up that involved the elementary schools. So I think I did not find any mention of District 2, although they did start to discuss the idea of merging the districts
Right.
towards the end of this period.
Right. Yep.
Though I'm not sure when it actually happened. I can't remember
I
that.
think in the late 50s, I believe my mom, who's on, Ruth Friendly,
Yes.
played a side part in that happening.
So we know that certain books are being attacked today. This is nothing new. It's just the way the specific topics that are being attacked in certain books are being, that's what's different. But what seems to be the same is the accusation of secularism, which I find interesting.
Yeah, I agree with you. Sorry, go on.
No, I mean, today it's, specifically transgender books or themes in books, books about sexuality generally.
And DEI.
Yeah, so I mean, it seems to be whatever is considered the most modern, I guess. It's another way of people not dealing with from their perspective what they see as secularism in society or not natural, let's put it that way.
No, I agree that there is definitely a constant battle in the schools over what types of things should be taught, how secular they should be versus religious. I went back while doing research, I went back and looked at the origins of the public school system, which really came out of New York City. And there was conflict early on between different Protestant sects about what version of the Bible to use. And eventually they agreed upon a standard quote unquote non-denominational version of prayers and other things to use. But that didn't include Catholics, who then ended up forming their own parochial schools in many cases. So it's interesting following that into the 1950s, the ways in which the Protestant movement to sort of standardize and come up with a general prayer and system for the public schools eventually sort of led to a more progressive beliefs about education, where religion should be entirely removed from school. So, and based on, obviously part of that is based on the separation of church and state, but it certainly wasn't always the case that the church and state were separated. You know, looking back at the history of public schools in the 19th and early 20th centuries.
Well, it wasn't until around 1960, I think, maybe a little later, that the Supreme Court outlawed prayers in schools. So it's not, I don't know about Scarsdale, but definitely children in New York City public schools were reciting a prayer. Whether one agrees with what the prayer stood for may have been all watered down to some people. There was still prayer in school.
Sorry.
And
Late,
if you read I think it was it the New York Times that had an article that said that Texas was the last red state that now permits vouchers.
there was something about the vouchers.
Right. So these controversies seem to reappear constantly.
I missed any reference or a name of the actual superintendent of schools during the course of the book controversy. Who was that, and was that particular person attacked in any way? Maybe you'll talk about that a little bit later, but if there was a constant in terms of the superintendent, who was that at the time?
There was. I mentioned his name a couple of times, but I haven't really talked about him much yet. His name was Archibald Shaw, and he was there the entire time. He actually was the acting superintendent in 1949, and in December, I think it was December of 49, he was appointed as the full-time official superintendent. His predecessor, whose name I can't remember right now, was at the end of a long term serving as the superintendent, and he basically was not ready to deal with this new thing. He had gone through enough and he retired. And Shaw, who had been an assistant to superintendent, took over, and then he was present until 1959, when he was sort of booted out for other reasons that, you know, something to do with consolidation or the high school, or, you know, nothing to do with this particular issue, but sort of like a coach. No, something eventually comes up and you can't stay forever.
Yeah, but just going back to the religion in school point, and I just looked this up because I have a distinct memory of when the words "under God" were put into the Pledge of Allegiance, and being told in school, because we always recited the Pledge of Allegiance in school, to say the words, "I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America," blah, 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 under God. And that was in 1954. And I think I was in 3rd or 4th grade. And I remember that debate.
And that was in response to the Russians, because the Russians were considered ungodly.
Yeah.
And we can't get rid of it now. It's there and we can't get rid of it.
Yeah.
Yes, actually, I'm Ruth Friendly, and I taught in all of the Scarsdale schools except Fox Meadow. I'm John Mark's mother. And I remember when Under God came into the pledge, and we did say the Pledge of Allegiance. And at one point, I think if someone didn't want to say it, they would be allowed to go out of the classroom, which of course would was a silly thing, but, or didn't have to say it. They could be silent.
I remember being able to be silent if I didn't want to say that in any of the
That's right.
comments, yeah.
Yeah. But it's interesting. As part of my career, I did programs with my late husband, Fred Friendly. We did two that are relevant to tonight's discussion. One was called, we did with the American Library Association, called Selecting and Limiting Books in the Library. And it was on this very issue. And I can remember one of the participants saying, if I was a high school student and I knew certain books were being banned, they would be the first books I would want to get a hold of, which I thought was an interesting comment. And we also did one on prayer in the schools. And our moderator pushed one of the journalists and said, what about singing God Bless America? You know, you can go right down and get down in the weeds. And there are places where religion, in a sense, comes into the curriculum.
When did you teach in the schools here?
I started in 1962, actually in Green Acres, and I taught there from 62 to 68. And then I came back in 74 and taught, when someone went on sabbatical, Ed Grossman, I taught for a year there, and then I went to Edgewood from 75 to about 1982, when I switched and joined with my husband to work on the programs that were on PBS.
Thanks for being here tonight. And same to everyone else.
And now I'm 101.
Oh, wow, congratulations.
Yes, and actually, I have another son who went through Scarsdale High School, Michael Mark, who is performing with Tom Chapin at Green Acres tomorrow morning. So that's off on another thing entirely, but I love the schools. It is a great school system.
Well, thank you. I just wanted to mention that the issue of prayer in school does come up later in my presentation. There was a standard version of a school prayer that was prepared by the New York State Board of Regents that the board briefly considered in 1952, and then in 1954, the American Legion Post 52 requested the board to consider adopting it again, although it never seems to have been adopted. Well, we're approaching 8:45 here. Does anyone have any final thoughts before we wrap it up?
May I say one thing? Miss Friendly has spoken about her husband, who's very famous, and I'm wondering if she has any access to some of the programs that your husband did and might be shown through the auspices of the Scarsdale Library.
Absolutely, I do. Yeah, I mean, I have them. Some of them are digitized. I do. Maybe we can work something out.
I think the Historical Society would also.
Maybe Dan is the person that might work it out, since I'm not affiliated with the Scarsdale Library.
Yeah, I think we could definitely work together to at least to preserve some of them. The Historical Society as well.
I thought we may have even given some to the Scarsdale schools. You know, John Mark is a former mayor, my son, and he's a good contact to work through too.
Okay, John Mark. Thank you.
All I wanted to say is, in terms of politics, the Communist Party became so irrelevant to American politics. It's kind of funny in a perverse way that there was so much controversy about it. It became so doctrinaire, so separated from the experience of most Americans that it became a joke almost. And by the time of the more, I'm talking about now my generation of people, the Vietnam War, it was like, who cares what they have to say? That people are going to go in the streets and do what and protest regardless of what the Communist Party says or doesn't say. It was more against the establishment of the Democratic Party, who didn't understand that world politics had changed. So it's more of a commentary. It's not really a question or anything.
Well, thank you, though.
Thank you, Dan, and we hope to hear from you soon.
Okay, thank you.
Yes,
Thank you,
thanks. Great. This is
everyone,
great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
so much. Have a good night.
Thank you.